I don't know about you, but this account has to be one of my all-time favorites. And do you know why it is one of my all-time favorites? Because Peter walks on water. Yes, Jesus walks on water too, right? Of course he does. But so does Peter. And do you know what that means? It means I'm named after someone who walked on water. Can you say that? Now, that's not exactly true. I am named after my second or third uncle, something like that. But still, Peter, the only other person in history besides Jesus to walk on water. And sometimes we can forget that when we read this passage. Jesus wasn't the only one walking on water that night. Peter did too, at least for a few moments. And what's intrigued me isn't that he walked on water, it's why he did it. Why step out of the boat at all? Some suggest that he was testing whether Jesus was real, if it was really Jesus. After all, the disciples thought that perhaps it was a ghost. But surely there was another way to test if it was Jesus. Jesus had calmed storms before, so why not simply just ask him to do it again from where he was? We often jump in this passage to another question, and that is, why did Peter sink? And it's an important question too, and we'll come back to it. But the more intriguing question, at least for me, is why did Peter get out of the boat in the first place? Was it impulse? Was it bravado? Peter just being Peter. Was it recklessness? Or was it something far simpler, far more instinctive, natural almost? Something that points us to the heart of what it really means to be a disciple, an apprentice of Jesus. Well, let's find out, shall we? For the next few moments, we're going to walk through this incredible passage and this incredible moment in Peter's life as we continue a series that we began last Sunday and discover what it really means to be Jesus' disciples. We pick it up in Matthew 14. Last week, church, you might remember, those of you who were here, that we were in chapter 4 of Matthew looking at Peter's call to follow Jesus. And you might remember how we reflected on Peter's upbringing, how as a young Jewish boy, he would have almost certainly have attended what's known as the House of the Book, something like a local Jewish primary school, where he would have begun memorizing the Torah, right? The first 5 books of the scriptures. From there, it's possible that he continued on to what's known as the House of Learning, like an ancient Jewish high school, where if he had, he would have learnt to memorize the rest of what we call the Old Testament. We can't know for sure if that's where he went, but what we do know for sure is that at some point after learning the Torah as a child, Peter followed into the family trade and became an apprentice fisherman. But by the time that we meet him in chapter 4 of Matthew, Peter is married, living in Capernaum, and likely around 20 years old. And then comes along Jesus, this remarkable rabbi from Nazareth who heals the sick, casts out demons, and teaches with authority like no one has ever seen before. Jesus calls Peter to become one of his disciples, that is, one of his apprentices, in fact, one of his first. And as with any other apprenticeship, Peter would have learnt in the same way many apprentices have, and as many apprentices still do today, by being with their teacher, by becoming like their teacher, and by going on to do what their teacher did. Those are the 3 goals of any apprenticeship. And as we began looking at last Sunday, of any disciple as well. That is to be with Jesus, to become like Jesus and to go and do as Jesus did. So we turn to Matthew 14, and roughly 12 months have passed since Peter's call. And according to Matthew's gospel, Peter and the others have heard Jesus teach about the kingdom of God. They've witnessed healings and exorcisms. They've watched Jesus calm a violent storm already on the Sea of Galilee. They've seen him raise the dead. They've gone out themselves to preach and perform miracles. And just before this account in Matthew 14, they witnessed Jesus feed over 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 pieces of fish. Now that's what I call a full year. All that in the space of approximately 12 months. The point is that by the time Jesus walks on water in verse 22 onwards, the disciples have already seen and experienced a lot, a great deal. And like other apprentices following a rabbi, they were with Jesus constantly. They listened to everything he said, even when they didn't fully understand. They asked questions, even when the answers confused them. And they witnessed everything he did, even when they didn't fully understand what was going on right before their very eyes. In many ways, these 12 men were just like any other disciples of any other rabbi at the time. But what made all the difference was the rabbi they were following. Jesus was no ordinary teacher. And the longer they were with him, the more they began to realize that he was saying and doing things that no one had ever said or done. He wasn't just exceptional. He was far more than they have ever imagined. They knew that they were following the real deal. As Peter himself would later go on to say when others stopped following Jesus. You might recognize this in John 6. Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life, and we have believed and we have come to know that you are the Holy One of God. These disciples knew that they were with someone, following someone, apprentices to someone unlike anyone else. So now we turn to Matthew 14:22. Jesus sends the 12 ahead of him so that he can have some time alone to rest and pray. The disciples head out onto the Sea of Galilee, and long before they find themselves caught in a severe storm. This particular body of water on the Sea of Galilee, Lake Tiberias, is known for violent storms that appear suddenly. But by this stage, they are long away from shore, battered by winds and waves. We then read Jesus finishes praying, sees the disciples in trouble, and then does something rather unexpected. He walks out to them. I mean, as you do. As you do. If you had the ability to walk on water and saw someone in trouble, I'm sure you would have too. He walked out straight toward these terrified apprentices. But notice what he doesn't do. He doesn't calm the storm. He doesn't calm the storm. I mean, he could have. He had done it before. But this time, instead of removing the storm, the chaos, he entered it. And understandably, his disciples panic. They're not used to seeing someone walk on water, just like you and me. I'm sure we would have panicked too. Someone is moving toward them across the waves. And so they did what the disciples did best and freak out. It's a ghost, they cry out. And they cried out in fear, verse 26. They don't know what to make of what they are seeing. Is this really Jesus, or is this something or someone else entirely? Again, notice what Jesus does next. He still doesn't calm the storm. Instead, he speaks. Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid. Or in other words, it's me. Don't freak out. I'll be there in a minute. And it's at that moment while the storm still rages, while the waves still crash, that Peter responds, verse 28, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. Now, this is the moment where we need to slow right down. Why does Peter want to get out of the boat? If he stayed in the boat, Jesus would have eventually climbed in. So why step out at all? Why address this apparent figure, this ghost, this apparent figure as Lord? Why ask Jesus if he could come to him? A casual reading of the text may suggest that Peter was testing Jesus. But after everything he's seen over the past year, and after Jesus identifying himself, that seems unlikely to me. Also notice how Peter doesn't ask for the power to walk on water. He doesn't ask for the storm to stop. Instead, he asks permission to come closer. Command me to come to you. Peter wants to be where Jesus is. Peter wants to be where Jesus is. He wants to be near his master. He seems to believe instinctively that it is better to be out there on the water with Jesus than in the boat without him. Now, we of course all know what happens next. Matthew tells us that after Peter walks on water, let's not rush past that part, what did I just say? Peter walked on water. Fantastic. After Peter walks on water, he actually walks out to Jesus. But then something changes. Peter notices the wind. He becomes afraid. And he begins to sink. In other words, Peter suddenly becomes very, very aware of where he was and what he was doing. He realized he was standing out on the surface of the sea, surrounded by wind and waves, and freaks out. Matthew tells us, verse 30, but when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. Notice what Peter does here. Who does he cry out to? God, Jesus. Which tells us that Peter knew exactly who he was dealing with. He knew this wasn't a ghost. He knew this was Jesus. And Jesus responds immediately. Verse 31. Jesus immediately reached out his hand, took hold of him, saying to him, O you of little faith, why did you doubt? Now, we often hear that saying of Jesus, and we understand it as a stern rebuke. At least I have over the years. A stern rebuke. And for sure, there is correction there. But we need not overstate the correction, the sternness of the rebuke. After all, Jesus doesn't say, O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" from the boat. He doesn't shout it angrily across the ocean. He says it while holding Peter. He says it while holding Peter. "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" Now, what or who exactly did Peter doubt? Surely not whether or not Jesus existed. surely not whether Jesus was powerful. Peter evidently doubted Jesus' ability, though, to keep him safe right then and there. He trusted Jesus enough to step out of the boat, but when he realized the step that he had made, he struggled to keep trusting Jesus moment by moment. Peter sank because fear shifted his attention. And the moment his focus moved from Jesus to the wind and the waves, confidence gave way to panic. But here's the best part. Peter sinks close enough to Jesus to be caught by him. We watched the video before, the dramatization of the passage. I quite like that, except I didn't like the part when Jesus and Peter held hands. I imagine Jesus scooping down and getting him. Scooping down. He doesn't hesitate. He doesn't let Peter fall. He reaches him and takes hold of him. And only once, when Peter is back with Jesus, once they are back together in the boat with the others, does Matthew tell us that the wind finally ceases. And once again, including Peter, they, the disciples, marvel at Jesus and say, "Truly, you are the Son of God." It's worth noting that while this account appears in Matthew and John as well, the Gospels of Matthew and John, as well as in the Gospels of Mark and John, as well as in Matthew, Matthew is the only gospel writer who includes Peter stepping out of the boat. In Mark and Luke, if you were to turn to their accounts, yes, Jesus walked on water, the disciples became afraid, Jesus spoke, he climbed into the boat, the storm ceased. No Peter, no walking on water from Peter, no sinking. Matthew, however, gives us a fuller picture, not just of what happened that night, but of Peter himself. Raw, impulsive, courageous, fearful, learning. And that's because Matthew doesn't want us just to see what Jesus did. He once again wants us to see what it looks like to be one of Jesus' disciples, one of his apprentices. And that's what this short series is all about. The call to be disciples, the call to be apprentices. Apprentices who want to be with Jesus, apprentices who want to become like Jesus, and apprentices who want to go and do as Jesus did. But unlike apprenticeships that we know today that only last a few years and then you get your trade certificate and you go on your way, an apprentice of Jesus, a disciple of Jesus, following Jesus, that's a lifelong pursuit. A life of drawing near to Jesus. A life of growing to become like Jesus. A life of practicing the things Jesus did. And it all starts with accepting the call to follow him, which is what we looked at last week. And now today, the first goal, wanting to be with Jesus. Allow me to make 3 very simple, very clear as day observations from this passage. Observations that I'm sure many of you, you're all very smart, may have already picked up on before and already know where I'm going with this. as we reflect on what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. The first of the three observations is this. Peter shows us that being with Jesus means choosing proximity, not just belief. Peter already believed in Jesus. That's not what's in question here. But belief alone would have kept him in the boat. What moved Peter wasn't just what he believed about Jesus. It was his desire to be where Jesus was. He didn't ask for answers. He didn't ask for explanations. He didn't ask, what on earth is going on? He asked to come closer, to come near. Friends, at the end of the day, it's possible to believe true things about Jesus from a safe distance. And many of us try. It's possible to admire him, agree with him, even worship him, but still keep him at arm's length. But transformation doesn't happen at a distance. You don't learn a trade by watching from the sidelines. You don't become like the master by staying in the boat, as it were. Being with Jesus begins with close proximity to him. The second observation is this. Being with Jesus is learning to place where to place your attention. Peter steps out of the boat. He walks on water. He comes to Jesus. But then Matthew tells us that it all goes wrong from there. Something changes, but not with Jesus. He was the same. Not the storm. The storm was still doing its thing. Peter's attention changed. Friends, the truth is we are always being formed by the things that we give our attention to. And Peter reminds us that being with Jesus isn't just about stepping close once. It's about getting back up again, learning again and again where to fix our gaze. I think if we were honest with ourselves, we would say that, a lot of the time our attention shifts, drifts. We can start paying attention more to the noise, to the pressure, to the fear, to the waves, to the demands around us, and less attention to Jesus, who is standing right there in front of us. Again, transformation doesn't happen at a distance. You don't learn a trade if you keep on getting distracted. You don't become like the master by looking away from him, by never looking at him. Being with Jesus means paying attention and keeping our eyes on him. And finally, the third and final observation for us this morning. Being with Jesus means learning to trust him over time. Learning to trust him over time. Peter sinks while he still is close enough to be caught. Friends, that little detail there, it really matters. Because Jesus doesn't let Peter fall. He doesn't walk along after Peter has already sunk. He reaches out and takes hold of him. And only then does Jesus speak. Jesus teaches Peter while holding him close. Closer, perhaps, than he has ever held Peter. Friends, that's how apprenticeship works. Not by getting it right straight away. Not by proving our faith in one bold statement or action. but by staying close and long enough to be caught when we stumble. Because we will stumble. We will get it wrong from time to time. We will sink, as it were, every now and then. That's just life. That's the human experience. Again, transformation doesn't happen in a single moment. You don't learn a trade overnight. You don't become like your master in one day, in one moment. You make mistakes, you get back up. Being with Jesus is a practiced way of life. So what does this mean for us? This means that the call to be with Jesus is not a call to try harder. If that's what you heard this morning, I am sorry. It's not a call just to try harder at whatever it is that you're doing. Do more. It is a call, rather, to reorder our lives around His presence. It means learning to notice where we've stayed on the boat, if you will, if you allow my illustration. The places in life where it feels safer without Jesus being too close. The habits, the rhythms, the distractions that we have quietly allowed in and close to us and that have quietly been transforming us into their likeness instead of His. And instead of beating ourselves up about that, the invitation is simply this morning to turn back to Him, to practice returning our attention to Him. For some of us, that may look like setting aside time, a small, regular space in the day, a quiet space, not to achieve anything but other than to be with Jesus. To sit, to learn, to listen, to pray honestly, even if the only words that come out of our mouths mimic Peter. Lord, save me. For others of us, it might mean paying attention to what has been holding our gaze. Our phones. Can I stop there? Our worries, our busy lifestyles, our schedules, our pace, and gently loosening their grip. Not because those things are evil per se, but because they do make very poor masters. And we have a far better one right in front of us. And for some, it may simply begin with awareness. Realizing how long we've been in the boat, naming that fact, and hearing Jesus say once again, "Come out to me. Come to me." And the best part? Jesus didn't shame Peter for what happened, for what he did. He didn't abandon him. He met him where he was, free falling, while sinking. He spoke, he invited, and he reached out his hand. Friends, the call to be with Jesus as one of his apprentices is not a call to perform spirituality. It's not a call to try harder and punish ourselves when we stumble. It begins simply with a call to stay close to Jesus. As we continue this Be Disciples series, we will see that everything flows from Him. We become like Jesus when we are near to him. We learn to live as he lived because his life has slowly, patiently formed ours. But it all begins here. It all begins here in the same place that it did for Peter here. By staying close to Jesus.